Welcome to the Second Reading Podcast from the University of Texas at Austin.
The Republicans were in the Democratic Party because there was only one party.
So I tell people on a regular basis, there is still a land of opportunity in America. It's called Texas.
The problem is, these departures from the Constitution, they have become the norm.
At what point must a female senator raise her hand or her voice to be recognized over the male colleagues in the room?
Hello and welcome to the Second Reading Podcast for the week of July 13th. I'm Jim Henson, Director of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin. I'm joined again today by Josh Blank, Research Director of the Texas Politics Project. Have you voted, Josh?
I have, early, of course, because I can't wait.
Early and often or just early?
Just early. It's all, they only had so many finger protection devices, so I decided I would save them for others.
Now I just saw this in a column. There's a technical name for those things, and I can't remember what it is.
Well, I have an idea what I think the name is.
Well, I think there's the name that everybody is calling them, and then there's the name that they are. Well, as that all implies, it's Election Day in Texas, runoff Election Day, that is. So the two main political parties are making final candidate choices in races in which no candidate crossed the 50% mark in the March primary that was held in what feels like roughly a million years ago.
Yeah, I think it was a million years in 2 weeks.
Yes, exactly. So today we'll talk a little bit about the context of that election. We'll probably hold off on detailed discussion until after we get the results. But we do want to talk a little bit about the context and maybe peg that and plug a blog post that we put together for today about the attitudinal context of that election. But first, we want to return to the topics of race, policing, and protests. For those that listened last week, we talked about the changing attitudes around the coronavirus pandemic that we found in the just released UT Texas Politics Project poll, which we had collected data for in the last week of June, more or less. And we talked about how decreasing concern in June had likely contributed to the surge in the coronavirus cases that we're experiencing right now. Today, we want to go back to talking more about some of the findings from the poll related to Texas attitudes about race, discrimination, and policing. And again, just a little bit about the backdrop to this poll, which people can find at the Texas Politics Project website, which is texaspolitics.utexas.edu, and then just hit polling and follow to the latest poll page is probably the most direct way to find all that. There's also a bunch of summaries if you follow the links there to the blog area. The initial idea in that poll was to follow up on an April poll that we had done with our partners, the Texas Tribune, and which was very focused on COVID-19 and to look at the changes in the COVID-19 attitudes from April to June. We planned another Texas Politics Project poll to do that because it was off schedule for the Tribune, but then, of course, thought it was important to add some of our trend items on attitudes about race and discrimination, as well as questions about the current topics at hand. So I think we ought to, talk a little bit about that, and they're important intrinsically, which is why we did it. But also they do form, I think, part of the context of everybody voting today. So we talked last week, I think we talked about this at the end of the podcast, the results of our standard discrimination battery. Now, those painted a pretty complex portrait of racial attitudes in the state, huh?
Well, yes. Let's start with the simple answer,
Yes.
which is yes.
That was sort of a softball.
That was a softball, yes.
A softball begging for elaboration.
Well, I was going to say next. Are we done? No, okay. No, I mean, that's right. But ultimately, is unsurprising here. This is complicated, right? I mean, just not to pull back the curtain on polling a little bit here, but ultimately this is something that we think of as a high dimensionality issue. And what I mean by that is that it's complicated, If we were to ask people, whether they have a positive or negative attitude towards the color yellow, that's yes or no. It's very simple. We don't have to think about it. When you ask about race and racism, well, what are we talking about here? Are we talking about systemic racism? Are we talking about race and policing? Are we talking about educational opportunities, healthcare? Are we talking about African Americans, people of color, I mean, setting aside racism and going to the broader topic of discrimination, women and men, gender identity, sexual orientation, there's a lot of space here, which makes it a pretty broad and complicated topic that really doesn't allow itself for like, oh, well, let's just ask this one question, right?
I think this, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And so ultimately what that means is that we have a bunch of complicated data, but I think it's paints a better picture. So, I mean, I think one of the things we may have flagged last week, but an approach that we've taken in the past is to ask people their perceptions of the level of discrimination that different groups face in society. And what we do is we give them a list of about 10 groups that includes whites, African Americans, Hispanics, Asians, men and women, gays and lesbians, transgender people, Christians, and Muslims. And these, to the extent of why that's the 10 we picked, we'd have to go back and actually think a lot about exactly what the particular reasons were, although I could think about some of them.
Yeah, it was the context of the time in which there was a discussion of both race and both gender in terms of discrimination against women because of the Me Too movement, and the ongoing discussion about LGBTQ rights in the aftermath of the legalization of gay marriage and an influx of activism in that.
Right, and then the intersection between that decision and the question about whether or not Christians would be forced to participate in gay weddings or various activities like that then sort of led to this, I don't know if I'd call it a backlash, but this idea that has been, present again before the extension of gay rights, but this idea that Christians...
a counter response almost. Yeah.
Okay, that's fine. Anyway, this is all to say discrimination is complicated, and what we do is when we want to learn about it is we begin by asking people how much discrimination they think each of these groups faces in society, in the U.S. today individually. And part of the value in this is that we both get to, again, get a broader sense of where, where people think discrimination lies. This is important. I always think this is super important when you're looking at any polling or any statistics, which is the obvious question is, well, compared to what? So in the most recent poll, we'd say, we found that 44% of Texas voters said that African Americans face a lot of discrimination in the U.S. today, as opposed to some or not very much or none at all. And I think that brings the question, well, 44% is a lot. It's almost a majority. Compared to what? Well, we can look two ways. We can look at other groups that we've discussed here and say, well, they say, Texans 44% say African Americans face a lot of discrimination. That compares to 42% who say transgender people face a lot of discrimination, 39% who say Muslims face a lot of discrimination, 27% who say the same of Hispanics, and so on and so forth. The other thing we could look at is say, well, how has this changed? And that's really, I think, where the value in running the same questions multiple times falls, where we learned here that compared to 2018, when we asked this set of questions last time, the share saying that African Americans face a lot of discrimination increased by about 9 points, from 35% to 44%. In 2016, when we asked it before that, it was only 30%. So we are seeing in Texas an increasing recognition of the discrimination faced by African Americans. But I mean, there's something else in all this. I mean, we've kind of talked about a little bit, which is, I mean, there's sort of another headline to this, which is like, boy, discrimination is a pretty broad problem. I mean, based on people's perceptions of it, and that there seems to be a lot of discrimination to go around, at the very least.
A lot of perceptions of it, so to speak.
Well,
yeah. I mean.
Yeah, I mean, I don't.
And the reality is somewhere in between there, I suppose, if we can want to talk about reality. Now, I think the thing that's interesting, you raised the time issue there, is that obviously one of the reasons we were interested in rerunning that battery, which this was the third or fourth time we had run that battery?
Yeah, that's right.
But we hadn't run it in a little bit, right?
Mm-hmm.
A couple of years. And obviously the killing of George Floyd in police custody in Minneapolis occurred, and the protests that resulted from that were triggered, put it this way, were triggered by that, emerged in the interim. And so that's a pretty big intervention in this. And we saw some of this, reflected in the question we asked about the protest responses.
That's right. And I should also say, it's a big intervention, but it's a big intervention where, people move from different baselines, right? So,
of course, yeah.
So, I mean, ultimately, before jumping, to the protest, I just say, Democrats moved, in a direction to sort of acknowledge more discrimination faced by African Americans after the recent protests, as did Republicans. But the difference is that Republicans were just moving from a much lower baseline than Democrats. So, whereas, in 2018, 35% of Democrats said that African Americans face the most discrimination of any of the groups that we tested. In June of this year, 60% said the same thing. For Republicans, there was also an increase, but it was from 7% who thought that African Americans faced the most discrimination to 16% who thought that African Americans faced the most discrimination. Just, keeping score at home, the group that faces the most discrimination, according to Texas Republicans, Christians, 28%. We can come back to that or not, but point being,
well, I think we touched on it a bit last week.
We touched on it a bit last week.
It's worth reiterating. Yeah.
Well, I just raised the point that people begin from different baselines. So then we asked again, do you have a favorable or unfavorable view of the protests that have occurred in response to George Floyd's death? And overall, Texans were pretty mixed on that, which I think, reflects an environment in which there's a lot of discussions both about, let's say the desires of the protests and protesters themselves, but also, some of the unrest that resulted, as I would say, both at the hands of protesters and police, probably, in different cities across America. So in Texas, we found 43% of voters with a favorable opinion of the protests, 44% with an unfavorable opinion. Among Democrats, 72% held a favorable opinion. Among Republicans, 73% held an unfavorable opinion.
So, some familiar partisan structure there, and, that we don't have a good baseline on that particular item, but the baselines you talked about in the discrimination item certainly, I think, have to inform that to some degree. Now, we also put attitudes towards the police in that mix as well. So, we asked a couple of different questions about the police. We asked about police favorability, and then we asked about people's attitudes about how they might think of the death of African Americans in police custody, right?
Yeah, I would say, I would think maybe how they interpret the attitudes of these deaths. I mean, to me, and I wish I could figure out a better way to say this, and I'll just say it this way, and I apologize before I say it, but to me, this was the killer question in the battery. I mean, this is the question that to me really tells us a lot about people's underlying perceptions of what the relationship between police and African Americans are. So we said, do you think that the deaths of African Americans during encounters with police in recent years are, on the one hand, a sign of broader problems, on the other hand, isolated incidents? And this is kind of this in a lot of ways mirrors the political discussion we see after these incidents, where, a lot of people who are, let's say, looking to defend police officers writ large will point out and say, this is a bad apple. This is an isolated incident. This doesn't represent policing. Whereas others say, no, this happens far too often for us to say this is isolated, because it, at least it doesn't seem to be. So we asked, what do you think? Well, overall, slightly more Texans said it was a sign of broader problems than said that these were isolated incidents, 49% to 43%. But again, that same partisan structure emerges, with 88% of Democrats saying these are signs of a broader problem, and 76% of Republicans saying these are isolated incidents. And I think the reason this matters, if you're sitting here listening to this, is if you're looking out there and trying to gauge the political response from both Democrats on the one hand, who are looking at, probably broader systemic changes to policing and a lot of other things, and Republicans on the other, who are saying, well, look, if we reform police practices, we can solve this problem. This is kind of, I think, the fuel that leads to these different responses, because their voters have different perceptions about what's going on.
Well, I think it contributes to, I think over the longer term, obviously this is not the first time that people have asked these questions. It's being asked in a more direct way. But if you look back at the longer historical scope of this, you go back, for example, to the political response in what was then called the Kerner Commission, which was named by Lyndon Johnson to examine the aftermath of the uprisings and the, it was then, this is really when the term came into use, the civil unrest
How
from,
nice.
That kind of emerges from, the first, kind of riots in American cities in 64 and 65. And then, the the recurrence of unrest after the killing of Martin Luther King in 1968, the discussion is strikingly similar. And it's, and the emphasis on policing and racial attitudes is strikingly similar. And that was, 60, 50 years ago. And so I think these underlying predispositions about how you view these institutions have been there for a long time. And the partisan lines have been pretty close for a long time, allowing for some of the changes in the Democratic Party.
Yeah, allowing for changes in the regional distribution of the parties and things like that, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I guess what I wonder, I ask you, because you brought this up a couple times, and I'm not as old as you are, so I wasn't around.
Congratulations.
Well, I don't know if it's looking that great. Anyway, that's a good question. Would I trade the late 60s and early 70s for the next 20 years? I don't know. Tough call. Anyway,
So it's an underlying. Well, we'll put a pin in that.
We'll put a pin in that. That's a high dimensionality question. But I guess what I wonder is, you said this before, right? That these are, that they feel very similar. And I guess what I wonder is someone who's been, watching public opinion for the last, let's say really closely for the last decade or so, is it's notable how much we see sort of a surge in interest in activism, and then it recedes. And we see this in the public opinion too, where this, these issues become really important. Democrats split one way, Republicans split another, or let's say as a society, there's more recognition, around some of these issues, and then I hate, there's no better way to say this, but we go back to normal, or to basically the status quo. Is there anything about this that looks different to you? In terms of your
Yeah, I would say, and we've talked about this offline. I think the thing that looks most different to me so far is that there has been there is a broader and different kind of range of discussion in how we are publicly asked to think about race. I think that, right now there is a discourse that comes out of, a lot of academic and activist writing, that is sort of caught under the umbrella of anti-racism, that, the idea that this is not just, that the response to this is not simply recognizing that there's a problem, but having an active incorporation of the problem of racism into your attitudes. And what I mean by that is that I think the biggest benchmark that was most commonly used in earlier discussions has been the idea that you're either a racist or you're able to not see color or look at people in a kind of quote unquote colorblind basis.
Right.
And I think there's a much more active part of the conversation that is moving that alternative farther out to saying, look, the idea of a colorblind society is to some degree a fantasy. And the underlying sort of dynamic here is that, if there's going to be a discussion of this, the starting point for the opposition to racism has to be not just that it shouldn't exist, but that there has to be an active recognition of its existence, of its structural bounds, and you have to recognize that as the fundamental position in opposing racism, rather than saying, well, wouldn't it be great if race didn't exist, or I can somehow don some kind of perceptive and attitudinal sort of position in which I don't see race. The bottom line is you can't not see race, and once you see it, you have to understand it as a hierarchy. Now that's one can argue the usefulness, the validity of that, but I think that position has become the opposing position, and it's a much more powerful position. Whether it how much, I think based on, keen on what you were saying earlier, it's very likely that especially given the current context, it takes a lot of energy to sustain that.
Yeah.
But, the kind of, I think the optimistic view, if you're concerned about these issues, is that even if it recedes, it recedes to, a different higher level of discussion that makes some degree of progress on the issue. But I think if I look at something that's really different, the institutional and political responses, frankly, look fairly familiar, even right down to, the corporate responses of, sort of corporate groups giving money to Black Lives Matter and trying to recognize the situation and respond to it in a very public way. I mean, we saw that, we've seen that in previous periods as well. But the idea is, are you going further? And I think to go further, you do need an expansion of the discourse in the way that I'm talking, that I think we're seeing. I would look forward to us figuring out a way to, to try to probe that.
Well, one thing I think you said this, but
now we're having a work meeting in public.
Well, it's okay. Well, no, let's do it. I'll say there's two things. One thing I want to say clearly, I think you said this, but I want to make sure it's clear, is that, race scholars and activists at this point would have gone even further and explicitly. Again, you said this. I just want to make sure it's clear to the listeners here. They've gone further than saying, that the idea of a colorblind society is a fantasy, to say it's actually detrimental. That you're actually ignoring the different institutional, facets of society that are making it so that, the experience of people is not colorblind, whether or not they themselves try to be colorblind in their viewing of society. So that's sort of the other side of that. I think, the other thing that kind of strikes me in this that seems to me like it could be different also, and I think Texas is a great example of this, is just the increasing, honestly, diversity of the population, and in particular of the younger population, right? So, ultimately there's a raw political calculus to all of this, which is to say, you can't, Texas is a majority, minority state, and it gets increasingly minority dominated as you look at younger and younger cohorts, right? Ultimately, this is the future of the state, in a place like Texas, but it's the future of a lot of states. And, to the extent that the political system isn't responsive to these concerns, that's going to create, basic electoral problems. But then the other side of this, that's kind of interesting, this is more the work meeting sort of idea here is, what I'm curious to see is, as there is movement forward on trying to address systemic racism, which requires seeing color and targeting policies to ameliorate the discrepancies, how do people who don't fall under those rubric, basically under those policies, namely, white people and white men, what does that reaction, white men in particular, actually, what does that reaction look like? Now, I'm not saying that, things shouldn't happen because people are afraid of white men or whatever. I'm just saying that as of right now, we're in a moment where I think, we're probably seeing a high watermark in terms of, interest and engagement with the topic. But once we start getting to the brass tacks of what the amelioration looks like, I expect to see a pretty big shift in attitudes amongst some groups of people.
Yeah, and who will shift in what direction, I think, is a big, and there's a, I think you're right to raise what are the, again, not to be too wonky about this, but what are the material correlates of this expansion of the discourse we're talking about? Ideas don't take in a vacuum.
I love that you preface that with not to be too wonky. Let's talk about the material correlates.
Yeah, basically it's like when somebody says to you, I'm not trying to be ugly, they're about to get ugly with you.
Right. No offense.
But to be more, direct or concrete about that. The discourse has expanded and the bounds of the discourse have expanded in the direction of a more thorough kind of anti-racist political position and discourse, because there are different people involved in the discussion now, as well as, I think we talked about this last week, you can't really ignore, I don't think, the ease with which, images and experiences are propagated, via more individual, ironically what we call social media, but is also more individualized media. In other words, the idea that, there's no controlling the image of George Floyd's death.
Nope.
Right. just as, and it has led to, a discussion of, if we saw this, what are we not seeing?
Well,
but the
it
fact
was to
that
say
you could
that,
see
yeah.
that and other images propagate so broadly and so quickly and are so difficult to control, but
Well, I'd even say
has also, broadened the discourse. That discourse is rooted in experience,
Well, I would say the attempts to control those images actually leads in the opposite direction, right? So when there is an incident under question and the police department in any jurisdiction says, well, we're going to hold on to the body camera footage, now they're automatically met with a certain degree of skepticism and suspicion that maybe, that probably, they never faced for most, really honestly for most of the country's history. And so it's just a different, that way, that's a good point. I mean, that is something that is fundamentally changed in a way that's not reverting back because it's just not possible.
And again, the dynamic is complex because we're also, it's not as if, per the numbers you were sharing, everybody has shifted in that direction. And so,
right.
For example, one of the things that's not changed, drastically, although there's been some change underneath, our attitudes toward the police, which we have to, we have a series of questions about, whether people view the police favorably or not. And I think, these are interesting, these are interesting numbers in very subtle ways, in part because there's no evidence, despite what I think you hear from some corners, that the public has turned against the police wholesale.
Yeah. No, there's no evidence of that. I would say, so in our most recent poll, 55% of Texans had a favorable view of the police, 30% had an unfavorable view. We've asked this 3 times before in 2019, 2017, and 2015, and the favorability numbers were always about the same. What you find is that, Republican attitudes towards the police have remained essentially unchanged, with the vast, vast majority of Republicans with a favorable view, 84% in the most recent poll. What has changed, though, is Democratic views. Now, again, the Democratic Party is a more diverse and younger coalition who are going to just tend to have different attitudes about a lot of these issues that we're talking about, and the police fall out of that, actually, in terms of how they view it. So in 2015, for example, 40% of Democrats had a favorable view of the police, 35% had an unfavorable view. So certainly ambivalent. It wasn't as though, Democrats were just, waving police flags around, or if there's such a, I don't know if police flags exist. But in 2020...
Well, they didn't probably early on, but they do now.
Oh, they do now, right, okay. But in 2020, in their last poll, 27% held a favorable view of the police, so that's a 13-point decline from 2015. 53% held an unfavorable view, so almost a 20-point increase in unfavorable opinion. So it's happening, but it's not, as you say, it's not as though, it's not as though there's this overwhelming negative view towards the police. I'm going to say even, among African Americans, 30% hold a favorable view of the police, 44% hold an unfavorable view. The remainder choose either to be neutral or don't have an opinion. So, even amongst, the group that's sort of being highlighted as those being targeted by police, it's a little bit more complicated than just, there's rampant anti-police sentiment. There's really not rampant anti-police sentiment. There's a certain amount of ambivalence, and it's getting worse. And I think we've written, and I'm happy to say this, it's partially getting worse with police departments' inability to address the concerns of the people they serve. Ultimately, I say this all the time, and it's kind of funny, when you think about it, but police are the government official you're most likely to interact with. And this is true generally, but, it's certainly true in, these urban communities that are actually resource poor. The police might be the one person you're going to interact with. And, and this is actually part of the broader discussion about, sort of the defund the police movement, which is to say there's a bunch of things that police officers are also being asked to do that have really little to do with police work, like mental health work, keeping, truancy officers in schools, things that are really not what we, technically think we're paying police officers to do, but something that actually makes their interactions with citizens more frequent and more varied. But I think we also see that in these numbers again, which is, for different people, their experiences with police are going to be vastly different. And it's not, some sort of overwhelming negative, basically, anti-police party.
I think that's right. And I think that, that institution, that attitude toward the institutions is one of the things that we're going to have to watch, I think, carefully as as we contemplate what might be different this time, what might not be different. As I said, the questions about policing that we're facing right now are not new. The terrain has been changed by some things, as you say, the underlying shift in demographics, the kind of, shot in the arm that police militarization got after 9/11. But the underlying questions about, what the police as an institution should be and how they should operate and how they interact in particular with communities of color have been around for a long time. And it's now, ask me in 5 years about this question of, what's different this time. And a big part of my answer to that would be what the outcome of that conversation is and whether, what the institutional dynamic looks like and whether there's real change in that area or not. So
yeah, and I would also say, I mean, I think this might go where you want to go, it might not, but I mean, I think it's also going to be interesting to see how people interpret the changes that we experience over the next 5 years. I mean, kind of what I said at the outset, which is to the extent that more active policy is put out there to ameliorate these differences, how do different groups react to those policies? But I mean, I would also add, we had another question here about Confederate statues and what should be done with Confederate statues. And we've asked this question a few times. And without going into the specific numbers, what we try to do is actually do a range. So it's not about removing or keeping them where they are, but we say, basically a 4-point scale. Should they be removed from public view? Should they be, Confederate statues on public property. So should those statues be removed from public view? Should they be removed from the public property, but moved somewhere like a museum or somewhere else? Should they be left, where they are, but with additional historical context provided, which is what some people argued for a while, hearing that less today? Or should they basically just be left where they are as is? And the share of people who said they should be left where they are as is has significantly declined since the last time we asked it. The share of people who say they should be removed in one way or another has significantly increased. But what's interesting, I think, in all of this, as you're saying, let's see where we are in 5 years, is what, again, the sum total of these, but more symbolic versus more policy-driven actions are, and how, again, voters in different groups and different blocks of voters interpret these actions with respect to both, I think, improving, just race relations in the country, but also how they perceive it affecting them personally. And that's, I think it's really easy right now to underestimate the extent to which a significant minority of people is going to feel like moves to ameliorate, racial challenges somehow affects them negatively.
Yeah, I mean, I think, the big question about who is going to embrace this, who is going to resist it, among those who are resisting these changes, how are they going to resist it? And of course, how big is that? And, that will leave itself, we'll get we might even get a few leading indicators on that when we see the election results today. We didn't really get to talking about the election, but since, it's election day and people are just voting, we'll come back to that next week. So I think with that, I'll thank Josh for being here. Thank our technical crew in the Liberal Arts Development Studio at the University of Texas at Austin. And we will talk to you all next week. Thanks for listening and be safe out there. And if you haven't voted and can safely do so, please do.
And wear a mask.
The Second Reading Podcast is a production of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin.